welcome back to Performance Process, everybody. I'm Kaylee Fretz, joined as always. Actually, I'm really joining you, Ronan. Let's be honest. Ronan McLaughlin.
Well, especially this week, because the episode we're about to hear, I'm going to say flying solo, because it's a bit of a segue to the guest that we're about to introduce. But no, it's not at all. Let's start that again.
No, it is. It's a good segue. Today we're talking about a new kilo world record. So kilo, for those who don't know, is a standing start 1,000 meter track event. The new record is 55 seconds.
There was actually quite little about the kilo in the end up.
Well, we're still going to talk to somebody related to that. We're also going to talk coaching. We're going to talk thinking outside the box. We're going to talk tech doping today. Ronan, who are you speaking with for this episode?
That was the thing. The reason I was saying flying solo there was because a clash in calendar last week meant that I had to record this podcast solo with Mehdi Kordi, who he's the coach for Jeffrey Hoogland, who just broke the kilo world record. We spoke to him last week for an article that we did on that new world record and looking into some of the optimization that went into it. And then we got Mehdi on the podcast to cover a few more things about that world record that we didn't touch on in the article, specifically in terms of the sort of power numbers and the torque that Hoogland can. I keep saying Hoogerland, like Johnny Hoogerland, but it's not. It's Hoogland
of barbed wire fame, which he's very displeased that he's of barbed wire fame, but is not that rider, to be very clear.
I should really remember Hoogland because it's like translated from Dutch. That means Highland, which is the name of our local radio station here. So Highland.
All right. In your defense, Rona, that's a weird reason to remember anything. But you should. It's not that difficult of a word. So I believe.
No, it's not. It's not. And I don't even need a reminder. I wanted to get a shout out for the Highland Wireless listeners out there.
What should people keep an ear out for?
I think, there's the obvious parts about the kilo that are interesting, but Mehdi's entire journey from rowing, which was the sport that he was into, all the way to being a cycling coach now, or head coach for the sprint team at the Dutch Cycling Federation, is an absolutely fascinating one. One of the things I wanted to sort of unpick with him was just, how he breaks down problems that any of the teams he's worked with might be facing, or sort of he's sort of renowned for thinking outside the box and finding new ways of tackling problems, and that ultimately proved very, very successful. And before I even had a chance to delve into them, he was already giving examples of how he, clearly thinks outside the box. Fascinating things from how he turned to a Strava segment to find subjects for a study that he was doing when he was doing a PhD with British Cycling. You might remember his name from the very first episode of this podcast. Johnny Whale mentioned him as the sort of person who came up with the Mehdi method, as they call it, his specific role within the team pursuit. There's countless other examples of that. The man has devised the CPR techniques for astronauts in space. So that's maybe enough just to let the listeners know that this one is well worth a listen.
We'll never be accused of providing information that our average listener can't use if we impart that particular astronaut knowledge, right? I mean, that's just, who doesn't need to know how to do CPR in space?
There are three options should you get stuck. Not sure what the sort of phone signal's like in space. You may not be able to look that up on Google while you're out there. So listen up now, folks.
The episode you're about to hear is actually for members only. So we've got about a third of it, half of it, something like that in this free channel. But if you want to get the whole thing, you have to head over to escapecollective.com/join. Once you do that, you'll get an email with instructions on how to get the members only podcast feed into your podcast app of choice. It's really easy. It's like one button click, takes like 90 seconds, and you don't have to do it again. You just do it once and it's in your phone forever, unless you cancel your membership, which we can see, and then we take it away. But just to warn you all, this is going to cut off.
Do it now so you don't get cut off halfway through.
Yeah, exactly. Just go over and
listen,
take care of this before we get started. Uninterrupted.
Mehdi, great to have you on the show. You've got a fascinating background, obviously very, very relevant at the moment with that new world record. I think we're going to get a chance to touch on all those things in this podcast. But just before we get into all of that, I purposely refrained from trying to paint your background and how you get into cycling because it's not the typical way. So I'm going to hand over to you to tell us a bit about yourself and how you got into the sport of cycling, and specifically how you got to where you are now, which is head sprint coach at the Dutch Cycling Federation.
Cool. Thank you, Ronan. Good to be on the podcast. How did I get into track cycling or cycling profession? Good question. Quite convoluted. Yeah, and how should I start? Went to Manchester Uni, did a biomedical science degree. I don't know why to this day still. Didn't do very well in it. I got a 2-2, which for those of you who aren't in the British system, I guess it's not very good, is probably the way of describing it. Decided I want to be an accountant. I don't know why, again. I thought it'd be a really good idea. So I went down to London, left Manchester. Yeah, failed all my exams. I couldn't even pass an exam as an accountant, so I got sacked pretty much. Then didn't know what else to do, but I'd taken up rowing, was a rower or an amateur rower, pretty average one. And for those who don't know, as an amateur rower, the holy grail of winning, if it's not the Olympics or the World Champs, it's Henley Royal Regatta. So that was everyone's dream. That was what kind of got me into sports performance, the first kind of thing. And then after I realised I wasn't going to be a professional in terms of working, so I wasn't going to go to Canary Wharf and make a lot of money or be an accountant or be a biomedical scientist, I decided to follow some kind of physiology or sports performance kind of thing. And King's College London had a master's there, which I went to. Ended up going to, after that, Peru and Brazil and then Germany in some research projects. And then luckily, the English Institute of Sport released 3 PhDs that were available. One of them was associated with British cycling. The other one was rowing and running, well, UK athletics. I applied for all of them. I only got one interview and one job offer, which was the cycling one. So after swearing never go back to Manchester, went back up to Manchester and did my PhD, and then phased into becoming a sports scientist for the para team, and then kind of got annoyed when I was speaking to coaches and the coach I was working with, why they wouldn't take on my ideas. So I thought, fuck it, I want to do this myself, and then became a coach, and then got a few offers with the sort of the, I think word got around about my PhD. I was doing my PhD, and then one of the job offers was from the Netherlands, and yeah, here I am now.
You never actually, or did you, work at British Cycling?
I did, yeah, no, I did. So
okay.
I was at the English Institute of Sport in association with British Cycling.
Okay.
When I became a coach, it was British Cycling.
Okay.
And I kind of a weird, interesting fact is I've never ridden a bike competitively. So I'm from Cambridge, where cycling is kind of the mode of transport, but I was so bad, I never actually bothered entering a race. So I've never actually competed in a cycling race.
You're probably not in the minority there of the general population in terms of how many people have taken part in a bike race. So we'll not hold that against you.
I think I'm in the minority of cycling coaches having never ridden a bike.
It's interesting though, because a lot of the time we hear, especially in sports like football and that often the best players don't make the best coaches or managers after their playing career. Clearly, it hasn't held you back not being a competitive athlete or a competitive cyclist, right?
I guess not. But yeah, I mean, just to clarify, I have ridden a bike. I can ride a bike.
Yes.
I just have never ridden competitively.
Yes. Yeah. I guess at that younger age, we're all in the same boat. We don't really know what we're going to do with life, and we end up, we often end up, many of us, taking career paths or taking sort of study that maybe we're not all that fussed on, not all that interested in. You seem to have the confidence and motivation and whatever is required just to jump ship effectively and change path as and when you felt you needed to. Is that fair to say?
It wasn't as crass as that. I had to kind of save up the money doing menial jobs to get money for my master's. And then I was working part-time when I was a rower as well and stuff like that. So they weren't as like I woke up one day and thought, you know what, I want to do this and this is what I'm going to do and I'm going to drop everything as of today. It was more like, okay, this is what I want to do. Let's see how I'm going to get there, and then to try and formulate a plan, in particular how I'm going to get the money to do it and go from there. But it's quite common. When I said I was in Peru and Brazil and Germany, so in
You're
Peru,
also in space, no?
Yeah, so if we're in sequential order, I went to actually Brazil first, southern part of Brazil, where I studied. I was part of a research project to research CPR in space. So for the manned mission to Mars, the CPR guidelines, or basic life support, so the heart massage, the pumping of the chest, was researched by me, or at least partly researched by me. And I think I laugh at this whenever I look back on it, because the irony is it's a one-way trip. So you're dying one way or another.
You're not coming back.
Yeah, you're not coming back. So if the guy's having a heart attack, what's a bit of basic life support going to do? Because he's going to die sooner or later.
Well, I mean, you could probably say the same about the same here on Earth, but it'd be nice if you could get a little bit longer.
True. But I mean, yeah, I guess
a bit more to live for here.
Yeah, a bit more, yeah, and it's definitely okay, yeah. I get your point, actually. Good point. Didn't think about that. And then the second sort of trip was in Peru, where we're looking at non-native adaptations to hypoxia, so low oxygen climates. So there are a lot of lowlanders going to the highlands, working in copper mines in the Andes, and they couldn't conceive, or if they did, it usually ended up in miscarriages. But highlanders living in lowlands, all fine. And this was kind of a medical sport angle, because it was obviously you could screen the people, if they're going to want to start a family, should they go and conceive in the highlands, where their work is, or should they come down? But also for altitude in sports, where you can just screen someone and get it, you're likely to have it be a relatively poor responder to altitude, at least sort of initial time frames. This is probably not for you. So that was quite an interesting one. Yeah, the story to that itself. And then went to Germany, which was working for the European Space Agency as part of the crew medical support operation, which is basically astronauts, where we did a astronaut selection, which was the first time it had been done in like 20, 30 years. And I was helping with the testing and the sort of analysis of the data from the selection process. Funnily enough, now they've just done another one, which it was quite interesting. But so I kind of had this convoluted route where I'd always kind of be working with astronauts was as close as I got to performance. But if you wanted to change it, there was so much paperwork, and it wasn't really a meaningful change. So I thought, I want to go into sport, which is where my passion was, and cycling is the kind of the one that came, the only opportunity I got offered, really.
I suppose rowing might have been the more natural fit at that time, given your background. But as you said, cycling was the only one that came up.
Yeah, the rowing PhD was about sleep. And I'm trying to find a pun here about it being boring and not appealing, but I can't. But I just couldn't really. It just didn't really. I did apply for it. I did want it, but just sleep science doesn't really interest me.
And forgive me if you've already said it, but the cycling one, or the British cycling one, was looking at.
It ended up being like it was so broad, because no one's really researched about sprint cycling. There's only been two sort of authors who've looked into any kind of physiology of sprint cycling. And none kind of in the recent times. So it was just basically physiological determinants of sprint cycling.
Okay.
And it was kind of so broad, it was like, just go figure. It was that broad, and I could have made it as complex or deep or whatever angle I wanted to go down.
I'm sure that is an entire podcast in itself, but can you boil it down to what did you find?
Being strong is important. There you go. I'll boil it down to just do loads of weights and ride your bike. I'm obviously dumbing that down is a different way to how you can do it, and what the physiological mechanisms are, what we think they are, and stuff like that. What I thought was the marginal gains, the absolute investment in science. I thought there'll be this line of riders like Chris Hoy, Jason Kenny, Laura Kenny now, sorry, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'll be pressing this button, and like next person will come and yes, we're doing this testing. And yeah, sure, we'll do anything you want, Mehdi. Yeah, great. That was not the case at all. They were so resistant. I mean, not necessarily the athletes. I guess they didn't really know, but the staff were just like, they didn't care about a PhD student. They just wanted to make sure that their riders won, and them at the time initially giving riders to my PhD, or the PhD, should I say, or the study, was just not very appealing to them.
Is that because it wasn't going to help those riders win in the next Olympics? It was potentially going to help British cycling win in Olympics to come in the future, but it wasn't really going to have an impact in that very cycle at that time. Was that the sort of barrier there?
No, it actually did help someone. So Callum Skinner, who ended up being the position 3 for the team sprint, some of his training spun out my PhD, which he was having difficulty getting on the wheel of Man 2, and some of the research I did. I'm not saying I'm taking full credit for it, but that was part of it, which he introduced that helped him get that gold medal, or the team the gold medal. So it did actually stick. It was just, I just thought they'd be sort of giving riders saying, yeah, this is good, and we can get this. These riders are great. And have these riders for a couple of sessions, blah, blah, blah. But it just wasn't the case at all. I had to get Strava, put a sprint segment outside the velodrome in Manchester, and then try and find these people who were clocking really fast times, and try and get them as my first cohort of people. So if you look at my early studies that I've published, or my PhD, which I won't wish that on anyone right now, but the people I use are Strava segments who are going really quick.
Do you mean like just, the general public who happen to be on Strava, or BC writers?
No, general public. So because the BC wouldn't give me any credit. So I was just like, who's this person? How can I find him? I look him up on social media, then try and contact them and say, have you done this segment in Strava? If so, I'm doing this.
Must be one of the simplest to set up and cheapest, but perhaps most effective forms of talent ID I've ever heard of.
Yeah, so to put in context, the reason why I had to do that was I was based in Manchester, but my university was Northumbria, based in Newcastle. So, typically what you do is, you go around, just grab people like sports science students and, give them a few incentives and stuff. But there's no one there in the velodrome that other than the athletes. So I had to think of a way. I remember my supervisor saying, Mehdi, you haven't got many data collected right now. But I had to think of something, and that was the best way I could come up with.
I have to ask, was there any funny experiences or stories that came out of the people that you had dragged from their commute into your PhD?
Well, there's a lot of suspicion, I think. There was also, who is this guy? Why is he contacting me on social media and all this stuff? But I also think there was a lot of exaggeration on people's abilities. So, I mean, you got to think, that I set up a segment, and then I was obviously keen to get these people in. So, after the second, or after a couple of days or the first weekend, I was like, okay, right, let's contact these people. And obviously there's only 20 people who have done it. 20 people have just gone past that segment on Strava. They're probably not that good. The selection, so they'll say, yeah, I've done this. And then when you go measure them,
they were going to get to go to the Olympics, did they?
Yeah, and they did. And actually, some people are like, I've hit 1,600 watts. I was like, okay, yeah, I can believe that maybe with what you've got. And there was one point I actually thought the cranks were broken, or reading off one crank, because one guy was getting 700 watts, and I was like, I thought you said, you were
doing
really quick. Yeah, and he was like, no, I am, and it turns out he was just weak.
Well, I mean, if a BC, someone linked to BC had come asking me, I might have been all for it as well if I thought there was some sort of dream to come out of it at the
maybe I should have sold them that, saying, if you're really good, I would have given you the talent ID, and just, no matter how good or bad they were, saying, sorry, mate, you're not going to make it.
What period was that? When did you start with BC? When did you finish?
2013. I started the PhD, and I finished in 2018. So the PhD actually, I left before I finished my PhD officially, but all the data was collected beforehand.
So within that time, that was when you crossed paths with the Hood Watt Bike Squad, Dan Bigham, Johnny Williams, those guys, Tipper and that.
Yeah. So my first sort of seeing of them was in Nationals, before they were famous. So that's my claim to fame. I was working with them before they were in fashion, and they were the most notorious. Well, they were notorious then. And I remember at Nationals, it's quite processional. The team pursuit is won by the academy, or a couple of guys that are thrown together in 4 minutes and 4 seconds or something for the men. And they had these guys who just looked, I've never seen them before. No, they looked quite senior. They weren't kids, but they were going quite fast. And it was quite a close race. I don't know if you watched it, but it comes down to that basic photo finish and they win. And I remember a lot of the BC coaches saying, "Oh, it's not the Olympics. Why are they celebrating?" But I was really impressed that it takes a lot of effort to put together a team pursuit, get the training, and actually beat someone. So I was quite impressed, and that all stayed with me. But then I saw them in the Glasgow GP and got to know them a bit, and I was like, why isn't anyone helping these guys? So I was saying, look, I've had my theories about a team pursuit, but they're put to being able to apply them, and they're really open about it, and that's where it kind of took off. Eventually, British Cycling, I think we got too good. And British Cycling said this is a conflict of interest, so they can no longer work with them, which, I didn't do, but that only lasted for a couple of months because I left British Cycling after that anyway.
You came up with what those lads have coined the Mehdi method, which is effectively their way of maximizing the potential they had. Johnny went to Man 2 and did the sort of extended run there, and then that was, that's been copied quite a bit since.
It was also the change when you got 4 riders, the lead rider goes from 1 to 3 rather than 1 to 4. You can basically distribute the energy differently with the rider of 3 and 4, which really helped us.
One of the things that I really wanted to delve into in this podcast that I think will be of use to our listeners, obviously you've detailed your background there. you haven't come from a cycling background, but yet you've sort of come into the sport, studied it, researched it, understood it, and sort of figured it out a couple of times over. And you've obviously got this outside the box mentality or way of thinking where, you're looking for riders. You've set up a Strava outside the velodrome. Like I don't think many people would think in that way. And clearly nobody had thought about the Mehdi method before you suggested it to the lads. Have you got an approach or something that you could pass on to listeners in terms of breaking things down? You're new to a sport like that. How do you pick it up so quickly, understand it so quickly? You weren't even working in team pursuit, but you identified something that could be crucial in terms of performance there. What's the method there?
I don't know. One thing I will say is that I'm not a clever person. What I mean by that is I don't read like a piece of information or a scientific journal article and absorb it straight away and digest it within a minute. Like it takes me like 3 or 4 weeks to read one paper and actually understand it. Whereas a lot of people can sort of intake it pretty quickly, retain it and apply it. I'm just persistent. I just believe there always is a way. How I broke that all down, I still don't know to this day. There isn't I know you're just getting with what you have and just rather than complaining about it. But I do complain. I'm not immune to complaining, by the way. And just trying to figure a way out. Like, the beauty of the Who What Bike experiment, when I call it an experiment, was that we had a gene pool of 5 people. Like, we couldn't be like, okay, this isn't working, so I'm going to get the next fastest rider in. It's just like, these are what we've got, so how are we going to get them round? And I think with that, everyone was just like, look, at 4, it's really easy. I remember Dan saying, yeah, I'm just ghosting. I was like, well, why do you always have to go at 4? I'm just trying to recall here exactly what it was, and that was my first thing. Like, well, why do you have to go? Or do you have to go at 4?
Mm-hmm.
And then everyone was like, no. I was like, well, why don't you go to 3 then? And then with Johnny, I was just like, well, how can we keep you like in the team longer? Because when you're tapping out, it was 12 laps to go, but if you tap out with 8 laps to go, that's obviously a kilometre less.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember just seeing Dan, and we did some starts on the track, and he was actually quite a good starter back then. And I was just like, look, you're starting really well. Can you just do the first like few laps on the front, and then let Johnny do 4 to 6 laps? Because that will save Johnny's pennies, and he can sort of spread them out a lot easier over, say, 6 laps rather than the first 4. I don't know if I've broken that down for you, but that's how I just thought about it. It was okay, can we just find a better starter than Johnny, and then we'll teach someone to go better, and then do it that way. But it never occurred to me beforehand, like, this is the tactic that was always going to work, or this is the strategy that was always going to work. It just kind of put it all together and make up on the fly. And we actually practiced all that stuff in one training session, and we had to race the next day. And actually, we fluffed it in the qualification. We fluffed it completely. I think we qualified 8th or something ridiculous like that, was 7th. But we qualified not as fast as we should have done, and then we got it right. So Tipper then just remembered to, because he was so nervous, to get out of the way and let Dan come to 3 rather than 4. And then we ended up qualifying for the medal ride-off. Yeah, going back to is there a method I use? Not really, other than just like the stubbornness of there has to be a way to work with what we have, or with the resources we have. And the beauty of like today, or this world, is a lot of stuff for free. Technology is out there. For example, the Strava thing I spoke to you about that was really available there and then. And then social media, I think it was Facebook messaging I used back then. Instagram wasn't in its heyday in 2013.
I think the easy answer to that question, or the answer that we hear quite often, is to question everything. Or the difficulty I find in that is question everything is one thing, but knowing the questions to ask is a very different thing, and a very difficult thing to let go of is the sort of what you've already learned or what you already know. Everybody in team pursuing knew a way of team pursuing and couldn't identify what you spotted because that previous method was so entrenched in their thinking. So, there's probably some benefit you had coming from outside the sport that, those preconceived ideas weren't already formed, and you could look at things differently. You spent an awful long time in the sport now. Is there any way that you can ensure you maintain that way of thinking, that you don't fall into sort of habits?
It's difficult. I mean, I think question everything is quite an extreme way of just saying, like, asking why are we doing this? And I remember when I first saw a high cadence drill, I was like, why are we doing a high cadence drill? Like, they never hit that cadence, and the coach does this, which is I don't know, for the benefit of those who can't sort of see what I'm doing. How do you describe this, Ronan? What I'm doing?
Clicking your fingers, like you're mimicking the cadence. Yes.
Yeah. And it's just like, okay, but what does that mean? What are we doing? What are the RPM they're hitting in the race? And they're like, maximum 140. I was like, well, why are you going to 160? just why. I mean, I'm not
Mm.
judging, and they can't really give a reason. And I always found that really, really odd. Like, when I'm done, why are we doing it? And it just seems that, well, that's what's always been done before we're successful. So the end. As you go into more senior positions, it's a lot harder to. I mean, you can still ask why. But it's a lot harder to change it. So I think when you're working with riders, it's more about. And I think there's understanding, there's knowledge, and then also the last thing and most important thing is application. So working with the riders, explaining to them, developing a relationship where you can say, hey, look, guys, this is what I think. And if the relationship's good enough, they'll go with it. But if you just don't really trust you or don't really understand what you're saying, they're never going to buy into it. But when you go higher, things get a bit more complicated. So, you have legal obligations. So, like with skin suits and equipment, if you're asking why, show me that what does the fastest mean? Can you show me the data? Why are you saying that this is the fastest? That only gets you so far, because if you locked in a contractual obligation, you have no way of changing it with equipment, or you just get what you're given. So it does get more complicated because the stakes are a lot higher in terms of money, and the overall stakes are being performance as well. So yeah, it gets more and more complicated and hard to implement as you get sort of higher up the hierarchy, I guess.
Okay, folks, Ronan here, interrupting the podcast just to say sorry. That's all there is for this free version of this week's Performance Process podcast. If you want to hear the rest of it, you've already heard at the start of this podcast that you need to head over to escapecollective.com/join, sign up, and do the one-time thingamajigger where you get the podcast sent to your feed from now on as a member, and you'll never have to hear me interrupt you again.